Hi there everyone, welcome back to another perfect pairing with me. Let's talk about no stress stamping with a satisfying and vibrant watercolor card. This card requires zero tricky watercolor techniques and is perfect for any skill level. Keep watching to see how to rapidly create two watercolor cards. The first thing I'll need to make this card is the new watercolor compact Moody Brights. This is a watercolor compact in collaboration with the Mint Gardener, and I love how stylish and sleek this watercolor pan set is. This portable and travel-friendly compact features a mixing palette in the lid, magnetic pans to switch out between the second Deep Muse watercolor compact for a custom combination, and the names of the colors are on the bottom of each pan, along with characteristics of each color. I want to familiarize myself with these colors before working on my card project. I'm using an A2 panel of Altenew cold pressed watercolor paper. I already made rows that are roughly 5/16 inches in height to make 6 rows on my watercolor paper. I used the 03 fine liner pen to make these lines. I'm also labeling the color palette and each of the color names on my watercolor sheet. The square number 18 brush in the Altenew round watercolor brush set is the perfect width for each of these rows on my watercolor sheet. I'll use this to create thick swatches. I'm using the Fine Mister water sprayer to hydrate the watercolor pans. Then I can start making my swatches. Making these swatches is going to help plan where I want my colors to go on my painted project. It will also give me a better idea of how my colors will look on my preferred watercolor paper. There are many ways to swatch your colors making these gradients, and it will give you a better idea of values that your watercolor can achieve. And also, it's such an aesthetically pleasing process. I'll let my swatch card dry and begin planning the main image on my watercolor project. I'm using the larger Altenew 9x12 cold pressed watercolor paper pad, and I'm cutting a full page from this pad. Then on my Stampwheel 2.0, I can easily fit the 9-inch side along the 9-inch square platform once I remove the guide on the right side. One side of the watercolor paper is more textured than the other. For stamping, I'm choosing to stamp on the smoother side of the watercolor panel. I'm stamping this large bouquet from Stamp and Paint One Happy Bouquet on the center of my watercolor panel. Then once I have picked a placement with a large space around the image, I'll use my flip plate to pick up the image and make sure that I get a great impression of this outline. I stamped the outline in Obsidian Pigment Ink. This is the perfect ink for mixed media applications like artist markers, acrylic markers, dual-tipped pens, and watercolor. This pigment oil-based ink will need a little time to dry, but once I set up my watercolor station, the pigment ink outline will be ready to color. I'm transferring this watercolor sheet to the 9x12 sticky mat grid. I'm hoping this will help hold my project to my crafting mat. I'm taking the time to burnish the watercolor cardstock by putting a scrap piece of paper on top of my stamped panel. Then I'll use the Crafter's Essential Bone folder to gently burnish the papers and press the watercolor sheet to my sticky mat grid. Now that my canvas is set up, let's grab some water and the watercolor compact. I like to have 2 shallow bowls of water, a paper towel, and the watercolor, of course. The first thing I'll do is create a light wash of clean water all over the panel. I don't want to create puddles of water. I'm simply hydrating the sheet evenly in a vertical direction, then a horizontal direction. While that water settles onto my paper, I'll start planning my colors. I have all 6 colors from the compact written on my notepad. Fortunately, there are 6 elements on this image, and I can easily match a color to each one. So I picked magenta crimson for the tulip, velvet berries for the open rose, peachy glow for the pair of daisies, lemon drops for all the flower centers, mermaid green for the foliage, and finally starry night for the hydrangea. The number 4 round brush is my go-to watercolor brush. I think it's the perfect size for card-sized images to achieve large washes of color, but the pointed tip also makes it easy to add details to areas of petals where they overlap or the folds of leaves. I'm right-handed, so I'm using a scrap piece of cardstock to rest my hand onto, and I'll start working from the top left to the bottom right of the stamped image. If you're left-handed, you might want to start on the top right and move down to the bottom left. This just avoids any color transfer from wet paints onto other parts of your project. To start my painting, I'm going to drop my clean water around the petals of the daisy image. I want to apply enough water to create a sheen on the paper, but not a puddle of water that stands up. That's usually my guideline for applying water and how I control the amount of paint being applied. While the water is on my panel, I'll pick up Peachy Glow from the Watercolor Compact and drop this color to the base of the petals closest to the center of the flower, and maybe some on the very tips of the petals as well. I'm touching the hydrated petals with my watercolor brush and letting this color flood the space where I applied color. This is the wet on wet watercolor technique. You are applying wet pigment to a wet canvas. This is so easy, and it's a great way to establish a wash and light tone of color. Once I've colored all of the bases of the petals in the pair of daisy images, then I can work on adding more layers and heavier applications of Peachy Glow. I don't need to hydrate the pair of daisies with clean water. The water that remains from previous washes is enough to drop in more color for the wet on wet technique. The illustration on this image is supposed to be loose and suggestive, not detailed, keeping the look fresh and spontaneous. I'll repeat this wet on wet technique with the leaf on the top left most part of my stamped arrangement. I dropped in clean water to fill the entire leaf. Then I'll apply layers of mermaid green to fill in the veins and base of the leaf. Same deal with the flower center using lemon drops, like how I planned on my little notepad. I'll repeat this wet on wet technique to establish a base layer of color to all the images in this one happy bouquet. Again, for the open rose, I used velvet berries, making sure the most concentration of this color is at the base of the petals and where a petal is underneath another one. Then I filled the flower center with lemon drop. I filled in the foliage with mermaid green and also created some shadow impressions of leaves. I dropped in some of my clean water in open areas where I think a blurry leaf would go. Then I dropped in mermaid green and let the color feather outward to create a hazy gradient. I filled in the tulip image with magenta crimson and the foliage with mermaid green. Moving down and to the right, I filled in the hydrangea bracts with starry night, filling in areas like the open rose. If a bract is underneath another, I added more layers of starry night to that area. I also made sure to leave highlights of the watercolor paper underneath. So no area in this image is fully colored with pigment, just drops of color and highlights made by leaving a portion of the image uncolored. I filled in the foliage with mermaid green, as with the rest of the bouquet, and also created those hazy impressions of foliage around the hydrangea as well. Lastly, I filled in the centers of the hydrangea bracts with lemon drop. I walked away from this panel and let it dry back for about 10 minutes to think and also get my packages from the porch, and that was enough time to apply another more detailed layer of watercolor to this image. This next technique is wet on dry. We are applying wet watercolor to dry images. This will create a lovely glaze to the entire image. I'm using darker values of the same colors as before to create additional depth to dry areas and blending this color with clean water. I also created mixes of color throughout the arrangement, adding peachy glow to the tulips, lemon drop to the open rose image, very, very light washes of magenta crimson to the daisy petals. Then for the foliage, I dropped in starry night and lemon drops to create variation in all of those elements. Watercolor takes practice. I'm by no means a professional, just a passionate card maker. Starting with a beautifully curated color palette like the Moody Brights Watercolor Compact, and planning colors is a great start on a separate project. Then using wet on wet techniques to apply a base layer, then wet on dry to establish details are 3 easy steps to making a beautifully watercolored project or two. Now I will let this page completely dry, and off camera I planned to strategically cut apart this bouquet so I end up with 2 card panels. I left enough white space around the images to make a minimalist arrangement, focusing on the loose watercolor of this image, but also enough space to plan for the sentiment placement. Here's the cut I ended up with, and now we can establish and finish these watercolor cards. I used jet black and pure white ink spray splatters to embellish this card. I add splatter to help fill in the panel, especially since these arrangements don't take up a lot of space on the card. It just helps the card appear fuller. Then pure white ink spray is just a matter of preference and style for me. Then I'll use my original stamp wheel and the grid flip plate to make sure that my sentiments are perfectly perpendicular on my watercolor panels. I'll use the same Obsidian Pigment Ink to stamp these sentiments on an open area of my watercolor panel. If you were good with your watercolor placement and usage, your panel should be relatively flat after drying. I had a little bit of warping on my panel, so I'm using the thinner 1/16 by 1/2 inch instant dimension foam tape to adhere the back of my watercolor panels before bringing them to my folded note card base. I used one of the corners of my stamp wheel stage as a guide to help perfectly center the panel to my folded note card base. And with that, we ended up with not just one, but 2 watercolor cards using some very basic watercolor techniques. Which one is your favorite? Collect moments or heartfelt gratitude? Let me know in the comments, and be sure to check the description box for all the products I used on today's card. There is another watercolor compact that I did not show in this video. Make sure you subscribe so that you don't miss out on that reveal and project.